Thank you guys for coming out. My name is Christian Cutler. I'm the director and curator of the Windgate Museum. We currently have 3 exhibitions up right now that have to do with gender and identity, one of which is a solo show by Jess Dugan. We are really pleased to have Jess here on campus and to be able to present this photography exhibition to you. It is made up of a portfolio that we, among other institutions, including the AMFA, has Jess Dugan's work in their permanent collection. We have recently purchased the portfolio of work that's on display in the exhibit. Jess comes to us from St. Louis, Missouri. Jess is currently teaching at, I don't want to get it wrong, the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts that is part of Washington University in St. Louis. And Jess has received numerous awards, one of which I'm very impressed with, which is the 2015 Champion of Change Award from the White House. Not to mention 2019 Infinity Award for Emerging Photography from ICP, which is the International Center for Photography. Jess, thank you so much for being with us. And without further ado, we'd love to hear from you.
Hello, everyone. Ooh, that's loud. Can you hear me okay? I was trying not to make any noise while Christian was talking because you could hear like my breath. Is that too loud? Yes, Mark is saying yes. Hang on. Is that better in the back? Is it still too loud? Okay. I have a good friend in the back row, so I'm looking at him. Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you, Christian, for that lovely introduction. I'm really honored to be here at the Windgate. It seems like when I turn my head, I get quieter. Are you guys feeling okay about the audio? Okay. It's really an honor to be here, and I'm so moved by the way you put the exhibition together. It looks really beautiful, so thank you for all of your thoughtfulness, and I'm also thrilled to be back in Arkansas and to be spending time with you all tonight. So tonight I'm going to share with you the work over the trajectory of my career. I'll start at the beginning with some early influences and early work, and then I'll go through a couple of different projects over the past 20 years or so. So this is me when I was 8 years old, and I grew up in Little Rock, which I think this is the first time I've given this lecture that I don't say Arkansas, because everyone knows where Little Rock is. So I grew up in Little Rock, and actually technically Sherwood, since I'm this close to you all. And I, from a very early age, was a very masculine presenting child. And this affected all of my experiences socially, at school. I didn't look the way a little girl was supposed to look. This would have been the early 90s. And so it was reflected back at me from a very early age that there was something about my identity, and specifically my gender, that was not what people were hoping for, expecting, looking for. And so I grew up with this really heightened sense of identity and how that affects how you can move through the world. And I like to start my artist talks with this photograph because so much of my work comes from my own life and my own experiences in the world, and this is an important touchstone for where I came from. So I moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts with my mom when I was 13, and I started high school there. And I was not at all a school dance kind of teenager. I was an angsty art student, as I'm sure no one is surprised by. But I was very politically involved. I worked with several LGBTQ nonprofits. I did a lot of public speaking. I did street activism. So as a political gesture, I ran for prom king. And I didn't really think that through to the logical conclusion, and I ended up winning prom king. So I had to go to the prom, which I had not accounted for. So this is my prom photograph. And again, I put this in. This would have been the early 2000s. Again, just to show that even as a teenager, as a child, my identity was always politicized, and I've always chosen to embrace that politicization in both my life and in my work. So I came out as gay when I was 13. I started questioning my gender shortly thereafter, and at the time, I did not see a lot of images of people who looked like me in mainstream media, on television shows and movies. I'm happy that that's changed a lot in the last 20 years. But for me, the first place I found images of people who I could really identify with and who I felt like looked like me was in fine art photography books. So I would go after high school, I would walk across Harvard Yard and go to the Harvard bookstore and spend hours just looking through their photography books. And I found artists like Catherine Opie in the previous slide. Diane Arbus was a significant early influence. I discovered books like these. I actually kind of came to photography through looking for representations of queerness through identity. And so I found this book on the left called Body Alchemy by Lauren Cameron, which was one of the first books of photographs of transgender men that was published. And then on the right, a book called The Drag King Book by Della Grace Volcano with writing by Jack Halberstam. And then I also found books like this one on the left. It's called Reframing's New American Feminist Photographies. And this book introduced me to a wide range of artists, including Catherine Opie, Carrie Mae Weems, Lorna Simpson, just this expansive grouping of female artists who were making work that was socially and politically motivated. And that was really influential to me. That discovery really cemented the path that I wanted to take as an artist. And then the book on the right is called Art and Queer Culture. It was from 2013, so it was not out at the same time, but I put it in because I feel like it's a kind of companion publication that I would go to if I were coming out now. So switching gears just slightly, I got my BFA at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design in Boston in photography, and when I finished my BFA, I got a job at the Harvard Art Museum, and my job was to photograph the collection. So I sat in collection storage. I photographed close to 30,000 prints all day, every day. I would show up to the museum early in the morning and be alone with the paintings, be alone with the work, and so the several years I spent embedded in this art museum really influenced my aesthetic. So my work is heavily influenced by painting, it's influenced by the broader art historical canon, and specifically Old Master work, Old Master painting. So these are a few of my earliest pictures. I was making these when I was just learning to use the 4x5 view camera, which for anyone unfamiliar, it's the kind of big camera with the bellows. You put your head under the dark cloth, it's on a tripod, it's very slow. And I was 18, I was in college, had already decided I wanted to be a photographer, but I was very much still learning. And I put these images in because at the time I wasn't thinking of this as a body of work. I hadn't yet conceptualized making a body of work. But when I look at these early photographs, I see the core issues that I'm still interested in now. And for me, those are an interest in people. I've always been drawn to make portraits. And specifically, I've been drawn to making portraits that go beyond the surface to talk about something more emotional or psychological. And I've also been really interested in how we read very complex things like gender and sexuality and identity through external gesture, clothes, pose, gaze of the eyes. So thinking again about how to make something internal with these external characteristics. So when I was 18, I had chest reconstruction surgery to more closely align my body with my internal gender identity. The language I use today is non-binary. That language has changed over the years, but my sense of myself has been fairly constant. And I made this picture of me and my mom. This was about 2 weeks after my surgery. My mom was very supportive of me. She came with me when I had my surgery and cared for me after. And I felt like it was really significant to make this picture. And this picture became important to me for a number of reasons. One is that it marks the beginning of my serious engagement with self-portraiture, which is something I've continued to the present. And I've always used my photographs as a way to understand myself and the world around me and the way I relate to the world. So this was sort of a significant beginning of that. The second is it's also the beginning of a long-term project photographing my mom, which you'll see. We continue to make work together. And then the third is this was really the beginning of what I conceptualized as my first body of work. I called it Transcendence. I was living in Boston at the time. I was part of a very active and vibrant queer community and trans community. But again, at the time, the images that I saw of trans folks in particular were either very negative or highly fetishized, or they focused around a kind of violence, and I just wasn't seeing any images of the kind of beautiful complexity that I was living. And so I wanted to make images of my friends, my family, my community that were more humanist, more complicated, more of the world that I was actually a part of. So in 2010, I switched to working in color, which you'll see has stuck. I have worked in color ever since. And I also focused at that time specifically on people within the transmasculine community. And I did that because I felt like it was the experience I was most part of. It was the experience I could speak to the most directly. And I was also interested in masculinity and the construction of masculinity, which you'll see is another core theme throughout my practice. So for a long time, I had avoided making pictures about the physical aspects of transition. And for me, that was because I felt like a lot of representations around transness reduced it to being about the body or focused only on the body. And I was always trying to push back and make something more emotional, more psychological. But at some point, I also realized I was leaving part of the story out. And so I was traveling with a friend of mine, Mick, and made this picture of him injecting his testosterone shot. And this photograph is significant to me for a couple of reasons. One is that it really, it embodies this fusion of a very contemporary subject matter with a very classical style of photographing or a classical style of rendering. And the second is, this is for me where I really start to see the influence of painting in my own work, and where I'm really starting to think a lot about color and light as being as significant as the person in the photograph. In 2011, I had a revision on my surgery, and I made this picture immediately after. And again, I've always felt like it's really important to include myself in my work. It implicates me as being part of the community I'm working within. It shows that I'm part of this larger conversation I'm having around gender and sexuality and identity. But also, and perhaps even more importantly for me, I've found that by sharing my own story in this very vulnerable and open way, it creates space for people to share their story back, both when I'm photographing them and just in the broader, my broader experience of being an artist. And I really value that kind of reciprocal intimacy that photography for me creates. So in 2011, I moved from Boston to Chicago. I was starting graduate school at Columbia College Chicago. For the photography folks in the room, I went there to work with Dawood Bey, who was a very close mentor to me, and also to work at the Museum of Contemporary Photography. Since I had had this career in museums, I wanted to continue that. So I went to Columbia College Chicago, and I thought I was going to continue making work for transcendence. So I quickly found some people to photograph. I started making portraits, and I realized pretty quickly that I was no longer interested in making pictures about one specific identity or one specific group of people, but I had actually become interested in making work about the process we each go through to come to know ourselves on this intimate level, and then how we connect with other people from that place. So I was starting to try to photograph something that was difficult to render in a single image and something that was larger than any one particular portrait. There are self-portraits in this body of work. And in this one in particular, I was really playing with this kind of like both classical art historical pose and also kind of typical like grinder pose, which I think grinder's probably outdated, so I'm showing my age or something, but you know, dating app pose, but playing with this kind of you know, certain type of masculinity and projecting that out at the viewer and asking them to engage with me. In most of my work, I have used direct eye contact, and for me, this is a way to, when it's photographs of other people, to allow them some agency, allow them to present themselves as they want to be seen, but also to really activate the experience for the viewer. I want to place the viewer in this moment of intimacy with the person that they're looking at and cause them to question their own thoughts and assumptions. So this work also has still life images. I've always made still life images, and maybe strangely for some photographers in the room, I've always found them harder to make than portraits. I kind of have to find them. But these, for me, in Every Breath We Drew, they were often pairs of things, and they were often things that came into contact with the body. And for me, it was a way to reference the need we all have for relationship and the need we have for intimacy, but without depicting one specific couple or making it about a specific person or two specific people. This is one of the first pictures I made of my partner Vanessa and I, and you'll see that this grew into another body of work, which I'll show you in just a sec. So in 2015, I published a book of this work with photographs from a 4-year period just prior. And this was my first kind of mainstream book that I published. And books have been really important to me personally and also for my career. But I, like many of us, I think, you know, discovered photography in books. And I was always really drawn to the democratic nature of them. I always loved like finding a book I wanted to spend time with and curling up on my couch and having this kind of intimate experience with it. And so I've been really passionate about making books of my own work. And you'll see another one in a little bit. And then here's an installation view of this work. And you know, I've always wanted my photographs to be big enough that a viewer can approach them and have a moment of intimacy, have a kind of personal exchange. The way that I frame them is meant to facilitate this kind of direct approach. But I've also never wanted my work to be so big that it becomes larger than life. I want it to remain intimate and relatable. And you'll see there's two sizes here, which you can also see in the exhibition here. This is at the Norton Museum in West Palm Beach. And then this is from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. This was from an exhibition called Personal Space, Self-Portraits on Paper. And when I'm included in group shows, they're often photography specific or queer themed. And so I get really excited when I'm in shows that are not themed by either of those things. Also, thank you to the curators in the front row for doing that too. And so I get really excited when my work is in dialogue with other media and the broader art historical canon. So in 2012, I met my partner, Vanessa, and I started making pictures of her, of us together, continuing to make self-portraits. And for a while, I really thought that this was part of Every Breath We Drew, because I conceptualized that body of work as being about intimacy and desire and relationships and connection. And then at some point, I realized I had made 20 pictures or something, and it was clearly becoming its own body of work. And then simultaneously, I had been making pictures with my mom, and it was about 5 or 6 years where I was just making these two sets of photographs, and I hadn't yet conceptualized them as one larger body of work. And then at some point, I brought them together, and I realized that I was really making this more expansive project about family. So for the past 5 or 6 years now, I guess I've thought of it very intentionally as such. This is something I imagine as a very long-term project. The passage of time is actually a core element of the work, thinking about how relationships change, thinking about aging. I'm, almost 12 years into the work, and I very much imagine making a book, but I imagine making one in like 15 years. I just want it to be this really long-term project. And, I'm interested in this series for a couple of reasons. One is that it allows me to talk about all of the things I'm interested in, identity, gender, sexuality, family, relationships, the passage of time, growth. But none of those things are the primary focus. They're all kind of beneath the surface of this framework around family. And then the second thing is that because I'm photographing the same people repeatedly over time, many, many times, it forces me to find different kinds of photographs, to make different kinds of photographs. And I'm really interested in that challenge, thinking about having this small group of people over this very long period of time. So I have a kiddo now who is 5.5, which is hard to believe. And when Vanessa got pregnant, I was photographing her. Like I said, I've always used my work to understand myself and my life, so my photographic practice has always been really locked in with my personal life. And so I was making pictures of her when she was pregnant, and then when Eleanor was born, I started making pictures with her and of her. This is one of the first images I made. This was 2 days after she was born in the hospital. Neither Vanessa or I had slept at all, and Vanessa had just had a significant surgery, and so it was this kind of intense moment. And I actually, I didn't intend to photograph in the hospital. I didn't go with my camera because I just really wanted to be present as a parent. And then I realized you have massive amounts of time in those first few days where you're just sitting around the hospital. So I had someone bring me my camera. But I'm really happy I have this piece. And then, was continuing out with my family, making pictures of my mom and Eleanor. Here she's 1 month old. This is me and Eleanor when she's about 5 months old. So I was making this work in this very personal way, and I was showing the work in lectures, but I wasn't exhibiting it broadly intentionally. I wanted to hold it back for quite some time. But it very quickly was reflected back at me through sharing it in artist talks and sending it to some curators, that there were very few representations of queer families and queer parenting, and especially butch parenting or transmasculine parenting. And of course, this is something I knew, and issues of representation have been a very significant driving force in my work. But I pretty quickly, in making this work, started to think about the role of representation, and really wanting to make work that addresses notions of queer parenting and queer families, but through my own very personal experience. I've been asked a lot recently if I'm going to make work about like queer parents more broadly, and I'm finding I'm interested in coming at it through this very personal place. Another thing I'm thinking a lot about in this work is the 3 generations that I'm now able to include. And for me, becoming a parent really altered my relationship with everyone and my orientation to the world, but it really altered my relationship with my own mother and allowed me to kind of have this dual vision where I could see things from her point of view in a way that I hadn't fully been able to before. And so I'm really interested in kind of capturing that shift in our relationship, and also thinking about, as we all grow older, including myself, including my mom, kind of what that means. And this was one of the first photographs I made where I felt like that shifting relationship was kind of evident. I was sort of taking myself out of this child role in a way, and like almost being more protective. My mom does not like her facial expression in this photograph, but I think it's really awesome. So something I'm thinking about, very intentionally, is this dynamic of me being the adult child of an aging lesbian identified parent and being the non-binary and queer parent of a young child, and kind of how all of these dynamics play out. So like I said, this is something I anticipate working on for a really long time. As Eleanor gets bigger, I'll be interested to see kind of how her interest or relationship changes. She was fairly easy to photograph up until 2. And then the whole time she was 3, I had an existential crisis because I couldn't make a photograph of her. And then I made this right when she turned 4, and I feel like there was this moment where she kind of learned to pose and to collaborate. I will say it's a very different process of photographing for me. The way I work with most people is very slow, very directed. There's a lot of back and forth. And making pictures of Eleanor has really required me to let go of all of that control and to work really quickly. And she'll give me the most amazing gaze, but she'll hold it for 1 second. So it's this totally different process of making pictures. But I'm really interested to see, like I said, now she's 5.5. I'm kind of interested to see how her relationship to the work changes as she gets bigger. This is another picture of my mom and Chris in Provincetown. Provincetown is a place I photographed a lot. It's the tip of Cape Cod in Massachusetts. And this image was made in the same location as the earlier one I showed you. So something I'm interested in too is revisiting the same places over time, and also in other bodies of work, revisiting the same people over time. And then this is a photograph from this summer of Vanessa and Eleanor, also in the same outdoor shower where that earlier picture was made. So I mentioned I didn't show the work for a long time. I held it back for the first 10 years because I really wanted it to develop into something larger before I made it public. Also, when Eleanor came along, I spent a lot of time thinking about what that meant to make her image public and kind of being ready to make those images public. But last year, I started exhibiting the work. So this was the diptych of us. This is in an exhibition that began at the MassArt Art Museum called Designing Motherhood, Things That Make and Break Our Births. And it was a larger exhibition looking at design and the history of reproductive justice. And so I'm really interested in kind of situating my work in exhibitions that just go beyond just photography exhibitions or art exhibitions. This traveled to the Gates Foundation, and I think it has plans to keep traveling in the coming years. And then this is one of the first larger exhibitions of the family work that I've had. This is at the National Portrait Gallery in DC, and it is still currently on view. It's a quite long run, so it's up for 14 months, which has been really lovely. And it was part of a group show, and each artist had their own room. So I had these 7 large photographs in the room. And I think this was a little naive of me, but I've been kind of pleasantly stunned how many people go to the portrait gallery, because I just get a lot of feedback about this show in this really exciting way. And some of the feedback I've been getting over the past year is just that it's really meaningful to people to see representations of queerness and queer families in specific in these kind of mainstream institutions. So that, of course, is satisfying for me. And then the Portrait Gallery made a catalog. The show's called Kinship. And they put this image of me and Eleanor on the front. And, again, of course, I was excited just personally to be on the cover, but I also thought it was notable that an institution like the Portrait Gallery would choose this very visibly queer image for the cover of the book. And then this is currently on view. This is another installation of the work at the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago. So one little subset of the family work is this annual photograph I make. It's a series called Self-Portrait with Mom. And in 2010, we started remaking that early black and white photograph. And we make it once a year. I'm really interested in kind of looking at our bodies over time, looking how we, watching how we change, watching how we age, thinking about whether you can read into our relationship from these photographs. And again, I view this as a very long-term project, and I intend to make it as long as I can. And something also that's sort of wonderful is, when I made that first black and white photograph, my mom didn't really know it was going to be seen so much. I was a student, and she likes to tease me. My mom's a Leo, so she really actually loves being in photographs, but she likes to tease me that she didn't think anyone was ever going to see this photo, and then it appeared everywhere, and her coworker saw it one day at lunch, and it was a whole thing. And what?
Your mom's a Leo.
Oh, I'm a Cancer, but I'm on the Leo cusp. Yeah. So anyway, when I first started making pictures with my mom, I wasn't showing the work, and she didn't have that conceptualization, but of course now she has this very clear understanding that the work is going to be public. And so her making this with me every year is this kind of affirmation of my personal life and her support of me, but also my practice as an artist. So in 2017, I made a video called Letter to My Father, and I started working in video in part because I felt like I had come up against the limits of photography in terms of storytelling, and especially I was wanting to make work about my past, and I didn't really know how to photograph that. So I made this video, and the script is a letter that I read out loud to my father, kind of trying to understand our difficult relationship and how things kind of went awry. And then it's overlaid with snapshots and visuals from my own archive. And so the video goes through my childhood. It talks about my early gender nonconformity. It addresses how I was always kind of looking to my father to be this masculine role model, but that always kind of failed. He didn't want to be that for me, and it was just never quite right. And then it goes through me coming out, and through my relationship with Vanessa. And I'll show you the world's worst marriage photograph. This is the only one we have. It's a blurry selfie from the courthouse. But it goes through the moment we got married, and our marriage was kind of the beginning of the end of my relationship with my father, because he couldn't support our marriage and couldn't support us wanting to have a child. And then the video kind of bounces back in time to look at things from his perspective and think about kind of his life as a young man and how his marriage with my mom ended in a way that he didn't want or expect, and so it kind of weaves in and out of time trying to make sense of this. And when I was making this video, it was incredibly emotional and difficult. I would drag my feet going into the studio, and I never drag my feet. I always want to make work, but I would just drag my feet because every time I went into the studio, it was this intense emotional process. But I basically looked through every snapshot I owned, and that process in and of itself was cathartic. And when I finished it, I was prepared for no one to be interested in it except for me. I was just maybe this is the most personal thing, and it's not going to resonate with anyone. And so I had this show lined up in St. Louis at this kind of off the beaten path venue, which was perfect because I had this room to imagine, but I knew not that many people would actually go. So it was the perfect motivation for making a vulnerable piece. Anyway, so I started showing it shortly after I finished it in 2017, and I was quickly pleasantly surprised that people related to it. And I think that it has become clear that the central theme of the video is really this desire to be yourself and live authentically, and also to have support from your family and your loved ones. And I think everyone can relate to that struggle. So this is at the International Center of Photography in New York. And then I just completed, like 3 weeks ago, a second video piece called Letter to My Daughter. And again, the videos, this one kind of came to me when I had a story I wanted to tell that I couldn't really tell in new photographs. And I also realized that, like, my art practice, I make certain kinds of images, but then I had all of these other images in my snapshots, and I wanted to tell that story. So this video traces my journey to becoming a parent, and my experiences through the first 5 years of my daughter's life, which include, things specific to being a queer and non-binary parent, but also just universal things about love and parenthood. So this will debut next month at an exhibition in Santa Fe. Take a sip of water. So in 2015, I started making Look at Me Like You Love Me, which is an extension of Every Breath We Drew. I really imagine my art practice as this kind of singular, never-ending practice. So I sort of put things into projects out of necessity and retroactively. But Every Breath We Drew and Look at Me Like You Love Me are the bodies of work that I consider my long-term, ongoing soul work. It's really the way I understand myself and the way I connect with other people. So in this work, I was still thinking about a lot of the same themes as Every Breath We Drew, thinking about identity, thinking about gender and sexuality. I've always been very interested in a gentler version of masculinity and kind of looking at what comprises masculinity. And I think for me, that has come out of my own search to define my own masculinity. And then there are also still life images in this body of work. And the work was obviously begun before the pandemic, but a lot of it was made during the pandemic. And for me, that was a period of sort of heightened existential questioning. And I was thinking a lot about, what it means that the core of who we are is often validated and reflected back to us by being in relationship with other people. And what did it mean when all of those relationships were suddenly severed and we were missing that? And so I was, spending a lot of time at home. And for me, I feel like my work during that period just on the whole took this kind of deeper emotional dive where I was asking these questions. And then also, I had become a parent by this point. And so even though this work isn't, it doesn't depict my daughter, it's not about family or parenting, I see a kind of weight in this work just around the beauty and immense love and immense risk of being in relationship, of kind of the weight of being responsible to another person. There are also a lot of still lifes of flowers. I was photographing flowers a lot over the past couple years, and I think for me these were a way to kind of talk about these existential questions more directly, to talk about time, how much time we have, what is urgent, like what makes a life meaningful. I was asking all of these questions about, these kind of bigger questions about personhood and kind of the essence of what makes a life meaningful. Even prior to this point in time, I had started photographing outdoors, and I was photographing primarily at sunrise or sunset, and I learned which of my friends will meet me at sunrise, which is fewer than the ones who will meet me at sunset. But I was really interested in these sort of transient times of day. I was interested in the quality of light, just how beautiful it is, but also really interested in how it was not one thing. It was, it wasn't quite day, it wasn't quite night. It was quickly changing. And I also did this in part to kind of throw a wrench in my own practice as a photographer, because when I went inside someone's home, I felt like I could make this kind of nice, even portrait. But when I was photographing outside at sunset, I just had to be responsive. And so I was also making it as a way to continue to push my own work forward. And then even when I was indoors, I was really looking for these kind of fleeting lighting moments. and yeah, this kind of ephemeral space. So there are quite a few self-portraits in Look at Me Like You Love Me, and it was interesting when I went to make the book in 2022, I realized that there were 5 self-portraits in the book, and I was not making eye contact with the viewer in any of them, which I hadn't done intentionally. But for me, I realized that this was really a shift inward, and I was just asking myself a lot of questions, and I was thinking about this kind of interior psychology and emotion. Whereas some of my earlier self-portraits were about asserting my identity to the world, I feel like the more recent ones were really this kind of turn inward. I've also been really interested in the new Portraits Outdoors and thinking about what it means to represent queerness and queer people in this expansive outdoor space and not only in this private interior space. That for me has been a shift that happened in part since I moved to Missouri. Christian mentioned I live in St. Louis, and I live near this 300-acre park where I spend a lot of time and I make a lot of pictures. And then, an image like this I made during the pandemic, and I know for sure I would have gone to their house if it had been an option, but it was not an option. So it caused me to seek out this kind of rooftop. That's the Mississippi River in the background. And again, this was made at that very last moment before the sun disappeared. And so thinking about queerness in this outdoor space, thinking about linking queerness with this natural environment, and also rendering it in this very kind of fluid, ephemeral light. This is a self-portrait from 2021. This was also made in Provincetown, and I've been going there a long time since I was a teenager, but I teach there every summer now at an arts nonprofit called the Fine Arts Work Center, and I make a lot of my work in Provincetown. And I also make a lot of work near water. So there's a strong theme of water in this body of work. There's a strong theme of water in the texts in the book, if you have a chance to read them. And I've always just been drawn to water on this visceral nature. Thinking about my astrological sign could be part of it. But the more I've been reflecting on it, I'm really interested in water as something that is simultaneously very solid and always in motion. And I feel like it's this very compelling metaphor for identity and personhood, how on some level we're always the same person, but we're constantly being changed by every interaction we have, every relationship that we're in. So there's something about this duality that I'm really interested in. And also back on that point, I'm also at the point in my work where I'm kind of referencing my earlier photographs, which is fun. So this one revisits a pose that I made in 2014. And so I'm in some ways kind of riffing on myself, but also just repeating certain gestures or certain places over this large passage of time. So this is the book. There's a copy in the gallery. It's called Look at Me Like You Love Me, and it came out last year. And I'll show you a few page spreads just to give you a sense of how it looks. I know you can't read that text, but I really approached this book as a kind of visual poem. I sequenced it based on things like color and gesture and emotion. I was not at all thinking of it as sort of a typical catalog. There was no formal elements like no curatorial essay, no interview with the artist, no acknowledgments. It was really just the work between these covers. And there are texts throughout the book, and the texts are really 3 main categories. One is a kind of telling of a memory or a story that's connected to a particular photograph. Another are texts that kind of psychoanalyze why I photograph, like psychoanalyze my own process, what it does for me, sort of why I'm compelled to make pictures. And then the third category of texts really centered around desire, both in terms of an intimate or sexual nature, but also this broader desire to be seen and to be understood as yourself, to be part of a community. So there's a lot of writing about desire in the book too. And you can see from these pairings, there's a lot of kind of still life portrait pairings. And so I'm really interested in what's possible in a larger grouping of pictures. I'm increasingly thinking about what's possible through a sequence and a rhythm. I've been thinking about my photographs as almost a kind of music and how certain images hit different notes and allow me to tell a broader story. So I've been thinking about this very much in this book, but also in the exhibition space. So here's a shot of one of the text layouts. So you'll see the photographs moved around on the page, and we treated the text in the same way. It's kind of their own design elements. So I'm going to read you this text, which in some ways is kind of the thesis text of the book. You pull him close, his head resting on your chest, eyes closed. Your skin glows golden. Your gaze is direct, open, gentle. I have always been drawn to the owning, the claiming. This is who I am, you say, and this is who I love. It is not easy being you and I. The world pushes against us, asks us to roughen the parts of us that are tender, requires us to code switch and self-protect. We spent a lifetime learning that what we know to be true is not what others hope for. But the pull is too great, the cost of turning away too high, and so we forge ahead, shoulder the loss, embrace the growth. We find one another somehow and learn to name ourselves, to embody our truths and own our desires. We act as mirrors, reflect each other, see ourselves anew. What is it I have been looking for all of these years? What am I chasing? I want to be close, but I also want to become. I want you to reflect all of the parts of myself I find it difficult to name, to exist for a moment solely in the space between us. I want to see myself reflected in you. Over and over, I invite myself in. Let me look at you, I say, closely, quietly, for a long time. Let us fall into a rhythm, my photographing in lockstep with your breathing, my attention astute. I will hold your tenderness, honor your struggle, respect your strength. All of this time in bed sheets and bathtubs, in fields of violets and prairie grasses, in intimate gazes and gentle gestures, I have been looking and creating space for myself. So something that's really important to me in my work and my practice as a whole is not just making the work, but how it's used in the world. So I've very intentionally focused on working with museums over the past 15 years or so. I really feel strongly about placing my work in spaces and collections where it will be seen, where it will hopefully cause dialogue, where it can be in conversation with other work. And of course, making books is part of that for me, just getting it out into the world. But another thing that's been really important is making these limited edition portfolios that make the work a little bit more accessible, particularly to teaching institutions. So this is the Every Breath We Drew portfolio that's here in the exhibition, which you can see in case you haven't walked over there. And I also had a portfolio for a different body of work called To Survive on This Shore, which focused on transgender older adults. But making these portfolios for me is a very intentional way of making the work more accessible, making it particularly desirable to teaching institutions where it will be used, in exhibitions and study rooms, but also like class visits with people outside of art, and to hopefully generate a lot of conversations. So this is another installation view. This is a show I had at the St. Louis Art Museum in 2021. And you can see how, again, the work is sequenced by like gesture and color. And this was an exhibition where I was really starting to think about the rhythm of the work as a whole and what kind of space was possible in the larger installation. I've also been increasingly exhibiting the work outdoors, which has been exciting. I think, of course, some of that is pandemic related. Some of it was happening anyway, but this was from a photo festival in Australia, and these were printed as these like 5-foot photo panels. And I love this democratic nature. I love that people come upon the work when they're not seeking out an art museum. That's also been something that I've been really diligent about in my work, is always positioning the work in the museum space, but then also in community spaces where people will encounter it when they're not trying to. And then with these pictures in particular, I was also interested in the public parkness of this setting, because so many of them were made in a public park setting where I live, and then to show them in a similar place was interesting. This is an installation in Berlin last summer. And then this is another version of the exhibition at the St. Louis Art Museum. This is at University Galleries at Illinois State. And this was actually the first time I pulled the text from the book and put it on the wall, which we've done here in the exhibition as well. And again, I'm increasingly moving toward these ideas around storytelling and thinking about how can I bring more of the story into the exhibition space? How can I bring more of the text? I'm opening an exhibition next month in Santa Fe, and I had originally designed it with a lot of text on the wall, and it was a total disaster with all that text. And so I recorded the full texts from the book as an audio soundtrack. So the exhibition will have these dark gray walls and the photographs from Look at Me Like You Love Me, and this audio soundtrack of my voice reading the text overlaid with the sound of waves that were recorded in Provincetown, where I made a lot of the work. So right now I feel like I'm really moving in this direction of just increasing storytelling and bringing more of that into book space, video space, exhibition space. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you all very much, and I would love to hear any questions. Yes.
So you said that obviously you're a professional artist now, and you said that you spent about 10 years building up your artwork before you did it. So were you working another job at that time, or were you doing more community involvement? And how did you get to a place where you felt you were ready to publish?
Oh, that's a great question. Thanks. Yeah, so could folks hear the question? Or should I repeat it? You can hear it? Okay. You know, so basically I knew I wanted to be an artist from really early, but I didn't know exactly what that would look like. And I mean, one of the things I've come to love about being an artist is there's no path, but that's really overwhelming when you're 20, 21. So the way that I did that looked differently. I mean, I was very committed to my work from my BFA on. So I was always making work, I was showing work, I was trying to build a career. Between my BFA and my MFA, I worked full-time in museums, and that was how I supported myself, and then I did my work on the weekends, but my goal was always to be an artist. And then I went to graduate school, thinking I would continue working in museums after, and I ended up moving to St. Louis. My partner had a job, a salaried job, and the combination of those two things allowed me to just try to be self-employed. St. Louis is a very affordable city, and I had some, this buffer. And so basically I've spent the past 10 years being self-employed as an artist, and feel really grateful for that, and kind of built up to this point. But I guess I would say I was always showing. Like I was always, in the beginning it was like juried shows and group shows, and just always sort of building up, working toward a book, working toward a bigger show. But the way that I've supported myself it has changed constantly, over the past 15 years. Yeah. I hope that's what you're asking. I went on a career tangent, but yeah.
It seems like place has been a really important theme for you, as well as family and identity. And I was curious how it felt now, kind of returning to Arkansas in your experience of leaving here as a teenager and really being able to fully express your identity in Massachusetts, and what it feels like to be back here right now.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, no, it is true. Place is really important. It's nice to be back. It's kind of it's interesting, and I've actually come back a couple times. My father and I reconnected earlier this year, and then also there was an exhibition at the Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts that I came down for. So this is my third or fourth time back, in this year. So I feel like I've reestablished this relationship with Arkansas in a way that's exciting, but I think it feels really meaningful to me to be showing my work here. And I think when I left at 13, I kind of felt then like I couldn't have been out in Arkansas, it just would have been so much harder. And so I think it's really kind of exciting for me to see Arkansas now, it's how it's changed. And so yeah, I would say it's meaningful for me to come back. I was saying right before the lecture, I think this is the closest to Little Rock I've ever like lectured, you know? So it's like, it's almost like vulnerable. I'm like, but it's really meaningful too. Yeah. And I've come back, you know, I made work here for To Survive on the Shore, and, you know, I've been back over the years, but yeah, within the last year, I have kind of more of a relationship, and I'm actually interested in making work here. Like, I would like to come back and make more portraits, and so that appeals to me. Yeah. No, thanks. Yeah. Yeah.
Light is clearly very important and a through line in all of your work. Are you only using natural light? And then in the processing, are you enhancing or at all, or is it purely straight?
It's purely straight. I mean, I use all natural light. I worked with a 4x5 view camera for about 10 years, and so that really informed the way that I photograph. I work digitally now, but I still, you know, my camera's always on a tripod. It's very slow. It's a lot of looking. I feel like my photographs actually really center around the light. Like they hinge upon the light. That's the thing. You know, I time my shoots very carefully for a certain kind of light, or with the still lifes, I sort of wait for a certain kind of light. You know, some of the flower still lifes, that light only appeared in a certain season. So, you know, it's this kind of, I do a lot of watching the light. But no, everything I capture is in camera. And I do kind of minimal post-production, you know, like levels and contrast. And but it's pretty straight. It's more about kind of getting all the elements right in front of the lens than processing later. Yeah.
That's funny that I was going to ask about the light too. I remember hearing you talk years ago, if your work had been inserted, you have sort of like a rogue sense of lighting.
Yeah.
And it was inserted in like historical paintings, right?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about your work in light, and I want to ask you, what did the juxtaposition of those two things mean? But I had time to think about it. It feels like an emotional intelligence.
Hmm.
Like there's such a stillness
Yeah.
and a calmness to your works, but like the mind is coming in through the light in a way, and I don't know if that how you feel what it's doing.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, I agree with that. I think for me, I think about it almost as a kind of like spirituality or like presence, but like spirituality in terms of like humanness, like not capital R religion, but like just this. I think a lot of my work is really about like personhood and like being seen, and so and being present and being like at ease with yourself, and so I think the light contributes to that. You know, yeah, and for a long time I used this kind of window light, which I think had this very direct painterly reference to, and I liked the softness of that. But then I think with some of this like sunset outdoor light, I think there's all of that, but then there's also this like sense of time. I mean, I guess with all light, there's a sense of time because you know it's fleeting. And with the flower pictures, like the light in the flower pictures is just, to me, it's like all about time, kind of life and time. Yeah.
About time and art a lot, and I got that from your work. But there's also a timelessness because you have no gadgets. Everyone is very still.
Yeah.
I love that.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Yeah, I remember once in grad school, Delwood was like, "Where's the stuff?" And I was like, "I move it all out of the frame. Like, there's no stuff. I don't want there to be stuff." But it is. I think I'm always after, like, I'm after specificity of the person, but it's this kind of like emotional, psychological specificity. So I like to pare things down. And even when I'm photographing outside, you know, I'll find like a section of the park where I can kind of isolate. Like, I like it to be this private little world. Yeah.
You still lives with the flowers specifically and the angled window light. It reminds me a lot of Vermeer. Were there any specific artists that really influenced you since you went through so many artists?
Yeah.
Photography.
Totally. I think in specific, I often think of Rembrandt or Caravaggio, just thinking about the light quality. But it's interesting, I'm kind of this strange like generalist. Like, I like to just walk through the museum and sort of absorb everything. So yes, specific people, but also just sort of this broader language. I mean, what's that? Right. I mean, I also love looking at paintings for pose. Like I pay a lot of attention to hands. I feel like you can read a lot in terms of like someone's comfort level through their hands. So one thing I do, like I walk through museums and like look at hands, you know? So I have this kind of like subjective way of moving through a museum space. Yeah.
There's actually a lot. Thank you so much. This is all so beautiful. I'm thinking a lot about like the photography with your mom and the letter to your dad. Has your work also like looking at yourself as I find a deeply uncomfortable, often endeavor to really, really sit and look. And I'm wondering, has your work like has anybody that you have photographed sort of said like, is it changing your mom's relationship to herself, or any of the other people who are now confronted with these images of themselves?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I guess with the family work, I do think just the process of making it has certainly affected everyone who's part of it. I think for my mom, it might be it might be partially that it creates a certain kind of intimacy, like us making pictures is its own kind of special thing we do together, and then I know she values the work that we make, but also like what that means to be out in public. Like at the kinship show, like her picture was on a bus stop or something, you know, so it's just like, I'm like, Mom, there you are, you know, so like I think it's also that, just the public negotiation. I know like Vanessa didn't like to be photographed before we met, but it was because it was her understanding of it was this like pressure, snapshot, perform, like, so she had never been part of art photography, so I think that process was really meaningful for her to like engage in something deeper. And then from time to time, like people that I photograph, you know, I most often ask people to sit for me, but you know, sometimes I'll either ask and then I'll learn it kind of came at, you know, people will say yes because it came at this like meaningful time for them, or sometimes they'll seek me out. And so there's a couple people like Shira and Jamie who I photographed who had recently had chest surgery. One was gender related and one was breast cancer. And I photographed them both for like a couple of years after. And they both spoke to me about how, like, Jamie actually asked if I would document her body. And Shira I had approached, but we made work for like 3 years. And you know, they later told me that like my beginning to photograph them overlapped with like this new body of theirs. And so the photographs kind of helped them in their own process. So sometimes that happens where it just kind of dovetails, especially when it's this like 3 or 4 year kind of commitment. Yeah, sure. And then I guess the last thing I would say is I'm always learning about myself, like through my work. There's this like cyclical process where I make the work like very intuitively, and then I sort of reflect on it intellectually later. I really try to separate those things. But I learn, you know, I'll make something and then be like, oh, like 2 years later, I'm like, that's what I was thinking about, you know? So it's like this constant cycle. Yeah. I saw a hand, yeah.
I guess my question kind of relates to what we were just talking about. Some you go through this cyclical thing. Sometimes it's more about yourself, and sometimes it's not so much about yourself. And you had this one comment where, you know, you're looking back, and you know that was kind of like hard for you necessarily to go to the studios with such an intense self-reflection, and it's very revealing, right? I mean, you're putting yourself out there in a way that I think you know every artist does put themselves out there, but maybe not to that extent. So I guess I want to know about the dichotomy between those two ways of working, and you ever really, you think, you know, you run into like your boundaries, like this is your boundary, you're not going to let people in that way, or maybe you are, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I have sort of two different thoughts in terms of answering. One is, you know, in my work I've sort of swung between this very internal subjective approach and an outward looking approach. So there's a body of work I made that I didn't talk about tonight just because of time called To Survive on the Shore, where I was photographing transgender older adults. And like that project for me felt very documentary. It felt about making space for them and not about my own identity. Oh, sorry. Whereas, you know, Every Breath We Drew, Look at Me Like You Love Me, that feels like one big self-portrait because it's so much about me, even though I'm photographing other people. So that came to mind. And then in terms of the kind of boundaries, I think the thing I would say is for me there's often a lag time between the making of the work and when I feel ready to show it. And so I have this sort of, I feel like I have this filter, like when I'm ready to make something personal public, like when I'm ready to make work about it or make it part of my practice. And so, yeah, I think I have like my own kind of internal sense of boundaries about what I'm ready to put out there. I know with the video Letter to My Father, I did start showing it right away, but in these kind of smaller spaces. And I would say that took me like 3 or 4 years to really like be able to talk about. And like that was a long lag period where I could finally kind of see it as a work of art. But other things have a shorter time, but like the diptych of me and Vanessa and Eleanor, I waited 4 years to show that because it felt, it just felt vulnerable. So yes, I think I have my own kind of hard to quantify internal system for kind of when I'm ready for something to be public. Yeah. Yeah. No, so the question was about if my father video was part of us reconnecting. I don't think so. I don't think he's seen it. I mean, to the best of my knowledge. Yeah, I don't think so.
Your photograph that was at the AMFA was of older adults, and I think what was important, some friends of ours that came that told us they did not expect to see themselves in that exhibit. Well, they didn't know what the exhibit was, but they didn't expect to see themselves. And I think younger people might expect to see themselves, but these people, Hank and Sam, were older, 70, but this friend of ours, several of them in their 60s.
Yeah.
I think it was even more important that we had the photograph of the older couple because I think it really spoke to a lot of our friends. Because as a younger person, you might expect you to be that shocked, but these are people who've been through a really hard time.
Right.
And I think they were really excited about seeing themselves. And I'm obsessed with Hank and Sam. I've looked at that thing 1,000 times.
Yeah.
Great photo.
Oh, thanks. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, one of the driving forces with To Survive on the Shore was to create representations of older trans folks, because there really weren't many. And, something we heard a lot from younger trans people, and I still hear, someone told me this last week, is that they had never seen an older trans person, and they had no roadmap for like what growing old would look like. And of course, that project is only a certain amount of people, but at least it's this sort of representation more broadly. So I love hearing that, that people connected to it. And I think, for me, I feel like so much of my work and career is about creating that kind of recognition moment. And like, I always wanted to see myself in work, and I just think it's so important. And this is sort of a funny story, but, when my daughter was little, we would go to the art museum like once a week because we were on this, 8 kiddo activity circuit. And the art museum was one of them. And I had this kind of like mind-blowing moment when she like loved all the paintings of babies. And I was like, oh my God, like she wants to see herself too. Like, it's just this like base level. Like I feel like we all like want to see ourselves. And then of course, when you're part of a community that's been marginalized, that just happens less. So like that lack can be so noticeable. And then when you see it, it can be so moving and validating.
The piece is one of the most popular pieces in the exhibit.
Oh, thanks.
People around it all the time.
That's great. Thank you.
Well, my compliments to AMFA for choosing it to be an open exhibition, which was big. But we learned, though, with the collection being, and the exhibit being so diversified, the audience was.
Yeah.
And that was the greatest first step for AMFA after this $1 million renovation.
Yeah.
Start off on the right foot. It's not a closed sorority fraternity anymore.
Right. No, totally. Yeah, and I think about that a lot. Like, in some ways, I'm often asserting the parts of my work that are not only queer. I'm like, it's about life, it's about family, it's about all these other things through the lens of queerness. Like, it's not only about queerness. But at the same time, I have this strong drive to like create visible representations. And like when I had that exhibition at the St. Louis Art Museum, I got really strong reactions because that's our like mainstream encyclopedic museum. It's been quite conservative and it's shifting. But people like in Missouri were really moved to see like queer couples in this like mainstream space. And so I think, you know, that's just so validating to me, but that's, even as I'm kind of trying to make sure in the work itself there's like poetry and all this complexity, I'm also really still committed to like creating those representations.
Well, we thank you for sharing your story.
Oh, thank you. I was happy to be part of it. Any questions in the back?
Thank you, Jess.
All right, thank you all.